Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of Insight. In Insight today we are going to talk about the Eurozone crisis. We know that the French economy has dipped into fresh recession. This is in fact the third recession in the last 4 years in France, and this certainly doesn't send a very good signal across the globe for all the trade partners as well as for the Eurozone. But how does our panelist also look at this crisis, and what does it what really lies ahead for these countries and the policies that their governments are supposed to take in near future? We'll talk about all of this in this edition of Insight. And joining me in the program is Professor and Dean with Jindal School of International Affairs, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. France, especially a recession in France, which is the Eurozone's second largest economy, certainly exacerbate the situation in the whole region and for its neighbors and for the partners. How do you look at the present state of affairs?
Shalini, last year when there was a change of government, there was a hope that France will move along away from austerity and towards growth.
Right. Because
there was a socialist government that's supposedly more concerned about the plight of ordinary people as opposed to the banks. But what has happened over the last 1 year is that France, is just at the mercy of the investor community. I mean, they are all still calling the shots. Credit ratings, the whole worry about public debt exceeding 90%. I think it's like 95% now of GDP. And I think they're so dependent now on German largesse and stimulus that they've had to conform to some of these deep budget cutting and so on. So they have left them in the lurch, and it hasn't worked. What they have tried to do is try to ameliorate it somewhat through some kind of social safety nets for the poor who will be hurt the most. But it's not doing enough to revive growth. And if you look at it on a continental scale, the tragedy of the European Union as a whole, and especially of the Eurozone, is that they have bailed out the banks, and it has added to the debt burdens of the states. This is what they call the doom loop, where the insolvency of the state is connected to the insolvency of the banks. So now they're trying to overcome it through the European Central Bank to directly bail out banks rather than go via the national governments. But there's so much resistance to a banking union and all these supranational entities. So one is bad fiscal monetary policies domestically. The other is, there's a structural interdependence of all these economies because it's an integrated single market, but without a common fiscal policy. So what has happened is that they're all, there are like three tiers emerging. One of the more fiscally responsible ones, which are doing better, like Germany, and then France is now joining Italy and the rest of the Mediterranean economies at the bottom in very, very dire straits. So what is happening is there is also a flight of capital and resources from these poor performing ones to the better performing ones. So while Germany is the leader of the pack, it's unable to offer anything because it's deeply stuck in its own domestic political process with the elections coming up in September. So they are taking very cautious moves. Angela Merkel, the chancellor, has not been the leader that she should have been in this crisis. So because of the regional integration model, which is flawed, what has happened is that piling on top of the domestic political and economic errors is this structural condition that limits any kind of policy change, a big policy change. And there's so much bickering and what can be called chaos, where these 27 members or the 17 who are in the Eurozone are just not able to come up with a common policy. So austerity, growth, what else can we do? Safety nets, breaking up the tax evasion and the tax fraud. What do we do with the lack of lowered workers' productivity? How do we revive growth when most of the other export markets in the advanced economies are also reeling? So they have very few choices, and it's a structural mess. When we go back to 1999, when they had the Maastricht Treaty and the creation of a common currency, the euro, there was so much euphoria. But what people did not realize that it was probably too hasty, given that if you have monetary union without some kind of shared responsibilities among the larger and the smaller powers within this union, you will have a day when there is absence of leadership and total policy paralysis.
But Dr. Chaulia, what would you like to say about this? Because this might just be true as far as my understanding goes, for the export-driven economies, where probably you can see that sort of a revival in their economies when they let's say push their agenda towards the emerging economies, invest more in their infrastructure building and other areas. Do you see that this is going to be a very effective way of looking at probably the probable solutions to this crisis?
It could be one. I mean, interest rates are almost at zero in the European Union, and I think capital will always look for higher returns elsewhere. So there is always, but then for it to be plowed back into the Eurozone and to help with employment generation, for example, which is so critical, will need state a prominent role for the states and for these multilateral organizations. I think the other big issue is with the public opinion perceptions. I mean, the Pew Global Attitude Survey has just come out with a very damning verdict. It's very provocatively titled. It's called "The New Sick Man of Europe," the European Union. Because there have been sick man of Europe. The phrase has been used since the mid 19th century, and most recently 1970s Britain was called sick man of Europe because it could not reform its economy and was stagnating. 90s Germany was called sick man of Europe, but now the Union itself has got this terrible title, and the public opinion perception is increasingly Eurosceptic, and that goes back to the democratic nature of this whole regional common market and regional integration. Because if that weakens at that level, where people are, France interestingly has become more Eurosceptic than Britain. Britain has always had this Atlantic tradition, which is away from continental Europe, looking towards America, and there's a big move within Britain to exit, what they call Brixit, from Europe. David Cameron is leading that whole charge. But if France, which is supposed to be like the heartbeat, it's like in the center of the European project, if France is, public opinion is saying, what are we getting out of this? Because they're looking at countries like Turkey, for example, that are part of this emerging set, that are growing. They're not in the euro. They had attempted to become part of the European Union. Now they're happy being outside it. They have their own currency. They can devalue it and get out of this mess. But when you are in a common, you cannot individually devalue your currency if you're sharing it with 17 other countries. So people are saying, what are we getting out of this union? It's only the Germans who consistently are saying, yes, we need the European project because it helps these export-dependent economies, because the common market is at the end of the day, Germany can cry about the burden being posed by Greece and Spain and all these, what they call lazy economies where people don't work and all that. But at the end of the day, Germany is the biggest beneficiary of the European integration. So except in Germany, the faith in the European project is at its all-time low. And I fear that any attempt to create more supranational institutions like a banking union or greater political union, which is actually necessary to resolve the problem, is going to be opposed by the people in these individual countries. So the democratic deficit and the distance between the average person in, say, in Seville, in Spain, or in a small town in Britain, and Brussels is growing so much further, to the point where people are not going to accept any kind of structural solution which is actually needed. So what this means is that from the grassroots, at the bottom, there's total resistance to this whole European integration project, and it is going to make the matters far worse to find solutions.
Okay. Dr. Chaulia, your views?
Yeah, just on this question of imbalances, the G20 has tried. I mean, they were supposed to have some kind of naming and shaming mechanism a couple of years ago to look at, countries which are not consuming enough, especially, and which are heavily export dependent, mainly Germany in Europe, China, and Japan. These are all export, intensive economies. So there was an attempt to kind of push them towards consuming more and buying more products from these totally debt-ridden and crisis-plagued economies of North America and Europe. But what's happened over time is that you don't get enough of consensus at the G20, which will lead to this kind of rebalancing. Because the Chinese are saying, we will adjust our currency only as per our domestic needs. Nobody should tell us that it's undervalued and you should buy more, this and that, right? So what's happening is that we still have this world of what one American thinker calls the G0 world, where everyone, each one is for oneself. So although the Westphalian system has evolved, we still have this notion of sovereignty and thinking about one's own nation state and one's own national interest at the expense of others. So it has become a zero-sum game in many ways, because the rebalancing has not happened. The Chinese, the percentage of exports of GDP is still very, very high. Domestic consumption is less than 40% of Chinese GDP, while in India it's much higher. So what has happened is that these export-oriented economies, including Germany, have not taken enough responsibility, which is my earlier point. Germany has to take the leadership and consume more in order to relieve Italy and France and Spain, because in the long run, if Italy, France and Spain and the UK are prosperous, Germany benefits the most from it. But what has happened is that Merkel is so stuck on her domestic re-election agenda, she has not taken those courageous initiatives for which she can be remembered in history, but which may lead to her loss in the upcoming elections. So the German people are not for bailouts. The German people are saying, let them suffer if they have to. Why should we go to their rescue? So this is the big, dilemma at the heart of this rebalancing strategy. The multilateral institutions and supranational entities are not able to push countries to take on greater responsibility and to share the burden. So we have this so-called G0 world. We don't have enough of a sense of good Samaritanship. The ones who have the surpluses are not stepping up to the plate, and they're only looking inward. So what is the global solution in this case?
What would you like to say about the French government also? Because there were a lot of criticism, in fact, has been done of Mr. Hollande and his promises that he made when he was voted to power.
So if nothing is working, if zero interest rates are not working, and you have nothing left to create stimulus, you need to do what are called structural reforms, right? So France has tried. They have just introduced a new labor legislation, for example. Because labor laws, people are saying in some of these Mediterranean countries and also in France, very, very rigid. And what it does is, it just impedes growth. So there was an attempt. They've just enacted a new law. But again, in it, there are various pressure groups. The unions are very strong in France. And in the socialist government, they cannot abandon the unions completely. And so, it's a compromise. They're calling it flexicurity, as in there's flexibility but also security for workers. But what it does is, so these structural reforms domestically in many of these economies are much needed. If you look at Greece, they have this strange system of monopolizing certain professions for certain segments and keeping others out of these. They call it the guild system and all that. Until they, revamp all these, in many ways, Europe has some very outdated and outmoded economic structures. And for these to be transformed, Germany did it. So from the sick man of Europe of the 1990s, Germany emerged, and now, it has like just 5% unemployment. So the German example is there, and the Germans want everybody else to copy it. And they say, why are they cribbing about, Merkel has been called Hitler in Germany and in Spain and in Italy and in Greece. But what are they talking about? They need to get more discipline. But then Germany must also show greater magnanimity. Discipline in the weaker economies and magnanimity in the stronger ones. If you combine those two, I think they'll emerge out of the crisis.
Okay, Dr. Chaulia, what are your expectations of these countries? Would they be in a position to, as I said, would they be in a position to embrace these suggestions in future? And do you see that environment really building in?
I think there is a big problem insofar as the states have not listened to their own people. They have prioritized the financial interests of the big banks over that of the lay people and the common folk. That is one of the biggest errors that's happened in the last 5 years since the global economic crisis began. And what this has done is has pushed people to the edge of the abyss. And therefore you have, these upstart parties. A comedian has won 25% of the vote in Italy. Right? So, truth is stranger than fiction. So this is what's happening now, and the levels of desperation. So I would suggest that, while we are talking about the big global solutions, we must also come back to the grassroots and look at the suffering of ordinary people, which is so central to this whole crisis, and their perceptions. They think that the governments have completely gone over to the sides of the banks. And that is the root cause of the misery. It's a wealth transfer that has happened in the form of bailouts worth trillions of dollars, both in America and in Europe, from ordinary people to save the financial system. Look at what the Cyprus government tried to do when they were in a deep mess. They tried to somehow preserve their role as a financial haven for tax evaders and for all kinds of dubious businesses. And they wanted to maintain that, and they tried to tax ordinary depositors until there was a revolt from the people. So when people will revolt in the depths of economic crisis, that is when you'll find new radical solutions come up. And that is, I think, where we have to go beyond these multilateral and supranational institutions and come back, because as the saying goes, all politics is local. And at the local level, today there is a big tussle going on. You can call it a class war. And it's ultimately whether justice will prevail. I think the Europeans have to adjust to a lowered standard of living in general. They cannot have it as good as it was when the credit was flowing and when it was okay before 2008. So I think we're looking at a horizon of 10-15 years where the general average living standards will fall. It will not come down to the level of developing countries, but it's a shock that will eventually be absorbed. But the bigger question is, who is going to take the bulk of the burden of this transfer?
That's right.
And will the ordinary people be able to come out with, we are talking about people rummaging through garbage cans for food. So this is, some parts of Europe are already in developing country or in LDC level, least developed countries level. So this is ultimately, I think, the social power. If we can, think about how we can, raise that to the level where they have a voice and a say in governance, both at this global level and at the national level, I think we'll find a solution. Okay,
so all the three different points that you've made certainly make a lot of significance and will certainly help the Eurozone and of course also guide the emerging countries to help in coming out of this crisis and at the same time maintain their own economic growth too. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for talking to us. Quite a pleasure having you all here. That's all we have for you in this edition of Insight. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.